Let's get started. Welcome to the Native American Heritage Month 2022 speaker series. We're so excited you have come to be with us today. We're excited to have you here. Before we begin, let me tell you about the Center for Global Partnership and Learning in partnership with Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education and Psychology. The Center for Global Partnerships and Learning offers a wide range of programs geared towards the advancement of student scholarship. We serve as a gateway for students and alumni to be able to develop their skills, elevate their voices, and develop their research acumen. Our focus is on the following areas. Scholarship Without Borders is our journal, collaborative research opportunities, certificates, workshops, and seminars, publication and conference presentation support. Through our programs and opportunities, we strive to enhance the student experience and ensure that our students can have access and support in furthering their academic scholarly activity. Tonight, we are blessed and fortunate and excited to welcome Sasheen Shailee Colegrove Raymond to be with us tonight. And so let me give you a little background on her, and then the next voice you'll hear is Sasheen. She is Hoopa and Yurok and a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe located in Northern California. She comes from the villages of, you want to say that for me?
Yeah, Takamildin, Medildin, and Wautec.
Thank you. Sasheen is currently a second-year student of Ph.D. in Global Leadership and Change at Pepperdine Graduate School of Psychology and Education. Sasheen is pursuing an advanced degree to elevate Indigenous epistemology and leadership models into mainstream practice to create transformative change. Native perspectives and Indigenous people are often forgotten, exploited, and risk erasure from history. Her scholarship and research efforts work to highlight and honor Native peoples. Sasheen utilizes her education and connections to reimagine and create an education system for Native peoples and their well-being. Please welcome Sasheen as we listen to her present on shifting the educational paradigm through Indigenous knowledge systems. We will have a question and answer session after she has finished her presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlotte. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Do you need to share your screen?
Yeah, and I think I have privileges, so I should be good to go. Awesome. So I will get started here, and I would like to just keep it as brief as possible because I would really like to have a conversation with everyone. I appreciate everybody coming to, take time out of your day and all that good stuff. It is very much appreciated. So, hey, Yankele. Sasheen Shailee Colegrove Raymond Ahoye. So I am Sasheen Shailee, or Sash or Sasheen is fine. I am an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe and also of Yurok descent. I'm coming today in Northern California in the place of Jirojiji, which is the Wiyot word for Eureka in Northern California. I am on the Wiyot territory homelands right now, which they are still a living, breathing people, but they are kind of a neighboring tribe to us. I'm not on my current reservation, but just so you kind of have a little proximity of place. And in the chat really quickly, I'm going to place a link. So if you guys get a moment, if you guys could go and check and see what Indigenous lands that you guys are all calling in from today and put that in the chat for me, I would really appreciate that. The map that you'll see when you pull up the site is really helpful and interactive, and there's different layers that you can add on to it. So I suggest you do some exploring, and anytime that I present at a conference, I try to always acknowledge the Indigenous land that we stand on, and also note that those are living, breathing people that are still with us today that steward the land. So when you get a moment, if you'll drop that in the chat for me. So today it's going to be pretty short. I just want to go over a few things and then we can have a lovely conversation. So first, I'm just going to go over a brief history of Native education. It's going to be fast and furious, but just to give you a little background. The journey, the second piece will be just a little bit about me and kind of what I'm doing and who I am and how I got here at Pepperdine Graduate School of Education and Psychology. And then we're going to move into a little bit of my scholarship and research efforts and kind of what it is that I am trying to do and where I'm trying to go. And then what next, which is just a little opportunities for you to kind of engage with Indigenous communities and some just different places that I think are helpful. And then we'll do question and answer. Before I move on, though, on the slide, you can see there's these 4 beautiful photos. These are all photos of where I live. And so I am nestled in the redwoods and in proximity to both the ocean and many rivers here in Northern California. And it is an absolutely gorgeous place. And so just wanted to kind of show you a little bit about my home. So kind of an overview here, you can see the pictures here on the right-hand side. These are pictures of boarding schools. And so this boarding school here on the bottom, this is Sherman Indian Boarding School, and I'll talk a little bit about it here in a moment. And this photo on the top is a pretty infamous photo. You may have seen it already, but it kind of depicts on what individuals looked like before they were forced into boarding schools and essentially assimilation into the mainstream, what is now present American culture. So previous to contact, there were millions of people here. There's high estimates and low estimates in the Americas of people that were flourishing, and they were interacting with one another and had vast civilizations. Whence contact occurred, the Taino people in Puerto Rico were first contact. And so here in California, we received contact much later. So I do want to note that some of these things are a little different in California, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So in 1794, the first treaty was signed, and part of the exchange of land, or rather stolen land, was an agreement that the US government would pay for education for Native peoples. And so it was a full promise to ensure that all Native children would have access to education. And the government said that we will do this in exchange for taking your land. And so the tribal people at that time agreed to it because they knew that it was going to be necessary for students to have an education if they were going to be able to live in this new version of America. Moving forward a little bit further, in 1860, the first Indian boarding school was really established. And the idea here, which you'll see 30 years later, somebody actually declares it, but the idea was to assimilate Native children into this very, very, different kind of culture than they were used to. And most of the Native people were pretty resilient to this because we had systems that were intact, knowledge systems, that we just had all of this knowledge since time immemorial. And so it was a real difficult transition. Because of that, the federal government decided that they needed to do more because Native people were kind of uprising. They were frustrated with the way that the treaties weren't being carried out. They were frustrated that their culture was being just dismantled, and it was a very frustrating time. So in 1892, Captain Richard Pratt, he declares this very infamous line, to kill the Indian and save the man. And the idea is that we were here as saviors. So a lot of what came in was from Christianity originally, and was essential to just really transitioning what tribes looked like. And at this time, there were forced removals of children from reservations. So this wasn't something that was willing. Children were ripped from families, very tiny children. The earlier the age, the more happy that the government was, because this gave them more time to reprogram the children. During these boarding schools, it was a very devastating time, and I'm sure you guys have all seen what's happening up in Canada with First Nations people, and here in the US. We're seeing a lot of really devastating things that we kind of always knew to be true. But there was a lot of very, very just violent acts that occurred. And a lot of this was forbidding children to speak their Indigenous languages, to practice their cultures. They were forced into learning different trades and things that they weren't necessarily going to utilize anywhere. For those who were females, they really forced them into what was kind of just servitude. So they would be working in houses as servants. And so they were really showing them how to iron and how to properly cook and take care of a family so that they could help the rich white families. Males were really for work, and so they were being programmed for work and tending fields and growing foods and crops. There were starvation, there were a lot of deaths, there were sexual abuses and other things that happened during this time. So at this point, you can imagine there is a lot of distrust from the US government and the education system. Families were devastated and hurt. Their children were being taken away from them at very early ages. Some were allowed to come back in the summertime, but most of them had to work during the summertime and use the skills that they were being taught to. So it was a very stressful time, and we're still dealing with that. This bottom school here, you can see all these children in the front wearing what is typical American clothing. This is a boarding school where my great-grandparents were sent to. And so, I mean, we're only thinking a couple generations back. I am relatively young, and so there are many who are still with us today and have experienced boarding schools. Boarding schools haven't gone away. There still are several Indian boarding schools, and while they maybe do not operate in the same way that they did previously, in my personal opinion, are still very oppressive and rooted in colonization. So it is an ongoing process and conversation about Native people and the education system. So there is a strong distrust, and that still exists today. When we fast forward a little bit here, 70 years or so, you'll see the Navajo Nation establishes its own community college. And this was the first in the nation that was tribally run, which makes it very different. And so this was an exciting time because Native people had access to education that kind of aligned with their value systems, and a little bit more with why we go to school and what we do, what our purpose is. A few years fast forward, the U.S. Department of Education, they established the Office of Indian Education. So again, trying to honor those treaties that the U.S. government has never really fully taken care of. This was one initiative which was trying to support the funding for Native people to go and attend school, both at the K through 12 level and what would be higher education now. Oops, excuse me, I missed a one there. In 1975, the Indian Self-Determination Act allowed tribes to use federal funding so that they could prioritize education within their tribal structures. Before that, it was really limited in what they could use federal funds for. And Native people at this time really prioritized this because they knew that this was going to be what we needed. We are, as sovereign nations, operate as small governments. And so it is necessary to have tribal people in roles that can do all things from being nurses and doctors to teachers, understanding finance and accounting to help us with all of our money and everything in between. So at this time, a lot of tribes really pushed for supporting Native people to attend college. Then when we move forward into the 80s, 83 and 89, we started seeing a lot more tribal colleges pop up, and they started offering bachelor's and master's degrees. And so this provided an additional outlet for a lot of Native people to attend school and feel a lot more comfortable in these spaces. And just to kind of give you a little bit of understanding, so I'd mentioned there were millions of people here previous to contact. There's some very high estimates on that. And so now when we're looking at, and this is US territory alone, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. And so that's all that is established. And there are 110 of those reside in California. And in California alone, we have the most tribes of any one state, and we have the most cultural diversity of any of the tribes. And so those in Southern California are very familiar a lot of times with tribes that have casinos or maybe resorts and things. Here in Northern California, in my home area, we have 13 federally recognized tribes. And so we are very blessed. We have the most densely populated Native population in the state. And we do serve a lot of those students, and there's a lot of, things that don't go well with that. But I feel like luckily our tribes have really advocated for the preservation of our land and resources, and really kind of kept a lot of Northern California untouched from a lot of, overpopulating and overbuilding and destruction of the land, although we have that. So when we're thinking kind of about education, we know now that access looks a lot different for, those who have been historically marginalized. There are a lot more opportunities for folks to attend school and to get training and further their education. Yet for the Native population, we are not seeing that same level of numbers. So in the last census, it was noted that 24% of Native Americans hold a bachelor degree. And that in comparison to the main population is significantly low. And when we look at graduate schools and specifically doctoral programs, it's really less than 0.3%. There's about less than 700 folks who are native to the US and have a doctoral degree, which is drastically different when we look at other populations. And so education still is a real stretch for Native people. And while there are folks who are, receiving their degrees and going on, it causes a problem with a lot of our tribes because we often have to hire non-Native people or contract out with other organizations. And sometimes their value systems do not align with ours. And so it poses an issue when we're trying to roll out programs and when we're trying to support our communities. And we have to deal with stipulations from either the federal government or the state government or whatever entity we're working with. So that brings me just to myself. And sorry, there's just a picture of me here, but I figured I would just chat with you all for a second. So, a little bit about me. So I was born and raised in my ancestral territory, and I am very grateful for that. So there was a time when many Native people got moved away from their ancestral lands, but because we were a late contract tribe here locally in Northern California, a lot of our land base is still intact. So we were fortunate enough to stay on our ancestral lands and weren't moved into a different place, which I feel very blessed to be kind of immersed here. I don't live on my reservation currently, but it's only about 60 miles away from me, which is very convenient. So I can easily jump in the car and drive. We are very rural, and so that has changed a little bit over time with the internet, but when I was little, we were pretty isolated up here. Just to know, it's often that one of our roads, if not all of our exits, are flooded or there is a slide of some sort, and so we are kind of blocked in here, and yet we're not quite to the Oregon border. When I was little, I just absolutely adored school. I loved reading. I used to read medical journals. Like I would sit in the library, like it was my favorite thing to do. So I just always knew I was going to go to school. And I wanted to be a medical doctor until I found out how much it cost. And I realized that that probably wasn't going to be feasible for me because like I said, the government had made promises about education being covered, but that was really not the case. And so as I navigated, I kind of started thinking about what I wanted to do. And so I attended Cal Poly Humboldt for my bachelor's degree, and I finished with a degree in Native American Studies with an emphasis in tribal judicial systems and business administration. And I really just thought that I was maybe going to be an attorney, or I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do yet. So I took a little break from school, and I had been working full time in a bank at this time. And so I went into the finance industry and I did banking and lending and financial planning. But there was something in me that just didn't feel right. The culture in the financial industry and in the corporate world really juxtaposes my personal value system. I very much am about the collective and not the individual. And so it was hard for me to sell things to people that I knew were in my community that didn't really need it. And so I realized it was time to make a change. And so I made a shift and I decided to start working at the university. So I took a job at Cal Poly Humboldt. At that time, it was Humboldt State University. And it was just really great. I really appreciated the work I was doing, but I've kind of transitioned several times. And in that time, I got a master's degree from Claremont University in organizational leadership, which I absolutely loved. And I was utilizing in just various capacities in my work and consulting. But there was something that was kind of missing in the program. I was used to going to school and never seeing a Native faculty or reading articles by Native people. But something was kind of really starting to bother me because at this level, I had expected that we would be looking at different epistemologies and different just ways of thinking and looking at a global world. And I wasn't seeing it. And so I decided to do my thesis on Indigenous leadership models. And for me, I really focused on participatory leadership. And that just kind of took me to another place because I realized there's only about 2 other Native people that write about Indigenous leadership in this way. And I thought, wow, that's kind of crazy. There's only two. And that doesn't seem right, because these are really important things. And this is a lot of how we were trying to establish governments. So I decided that I needed to go get another degree. And the reason being is, one, I work in higher education, and it is a little difficult to navigate when you don't have a doctoral degree. Two, to be taken really serious in the academic world. And as far as publishing goes, I also knew that it was going to be important. And then the other piece that was really, I don't know, I guess just kind of came to light, and this was really from a lot of my mentors, is that often tribes and tribal entities have to have program assessment, evaluation, research done, and they contract out with non-native people. And that's kind of a problem. So when the things are getting written up and there is a different, worldview, it really changes the outcomes and how we look at things. And often when we look at Native people, like I brought you guys a lot of information and it was kind of somber, but there's so much more than just this really devastating historical piece. There's a lot of resiliency. There's a lot of really amazing things that are coming out. Now we're seeing science catching up to traditional ecological knowledge. We're seeing science catching up to all the things that we knew to be true. And so I just felt the need to kind of continue. So I'm going to just transition a little into my scholarship and research activities. So currently at Cal Poly Humboldt, I am very lucky. I am the director of ITEP, which is our Native Support Program on campus, as well as Elite Scholars, which is for our former foster youth on campus. And so I really get to be immersed in a lot of the work that I want to do. And I have a passion for students and supporting them and really supporting my community. And this is one way that I'm able to do it. And so up on the top here on the left-hand side, that photo was the class of 2022 for ITEP. And so these are Native folks from all over the US, and they just graduated with master's and bachelor's degrees, which is really phenomenal. So it was very exciting to see this many graduates. And then on the bottom here, I was very lucky this past summer to attend the National Conference on Race and Education here in Portland, and I got to take a couple students with us, which was lovely. And we presented some of my thesis research, as well as some of their just experience in the program and how it impacted them. And so these are just things that keep me really motivated and positive, even when things seem really dire. So I am really grateful. I talked a little bit about my Indigenous participatory leadership research and really how I feel like it is so crucial that we look at alternatives to leadership and development. Even in our program, which I am very grateful for everything, Pepperdine really tries to diversify a lot of the things that we read. But I'm still yet to find a faculty who has provided me an article or a resource by an Indigenous person. So I'm always, hoping that we'll see that soon and see it kind of more infused in traditional curriculum, because Indigenous ways of knowing and being really do support and resonate with tribal communities around the world. And really ultimately this idea of collectivism versus individualism and really supporting one another for our overall well-being. And this is true for all peoples. Native student success, which looks so much different than a lot of the research we see on what Native success is. For us, it's not about GPA. It's not about, fancy schools. It's not about anything other than supporting our communities and doing the work we want to do. And it's so much more helpful when we have different pedagogies and andragogies that are, in the curriculum that are looking at, culturally responsive needs to communities, and not just this idea of, either pushing a product or productivity or something that really is centralized capitalism. For us, it's really about the supporting of communities and really all of our overall well-being. So, looking at both spiritual, mental, physical, our overall holistic approach to things is really important for all students, but especially Native students. Right now, I'm looking at confidence, self-efficacy, self-esteem, and ownership. I have a strong belief system that it is more important for students to have an ownership on a campus versus just belonging, because our students are filled with so many amazing things. They have a lot of wisdom that comes from, their long line of ancestors and all of the information that has been, really put into them. And so I think it goes deeper than that. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at right now. Again, just always re-indigenizing the education system, really looking at, alternative epistemologies and a praxis for how we approach education is so important. And I think this is true for most communities, is that we would fare a lot better if we had this very centralized curriculum that was more indigenized. And so it had a lot more meaning and application, and not just, the need to regurgitate facts because a faculty told you to. And so really that's just shifting the educational paradigm. And as I mentioned, it's an ongoing process, and it's a struggle, especially, for most historically marginalized communities and Native folks in the education system. And so recreating that trust and developing something that is really centered in the needs of the population, I think is really, really helpful. So kind of some of my life works. And then ultimately just, I think we're all trying to do this, is just really redefining the narratives, right? And how we approach things, and what are the purpose of institutions and higher education, and why are we doing this? One thing I appreciated so much about Pepperdine in our orientation is that it was essential we had a why, like our purpose. And for me, these are the reasons why I'm doing all this, why, we're all balancing these millions of things and trying to navigate and do homework and work and all of these really crucial things, but there is a reason for it. So I am going to put some more links in the chat, and this is just so you can see all of the things that I have here in the slide. So I also got to attend Friday's webinar, which was phenomenal. And there were some questions that came up, and I was like, oh, these are really great questions. So I thought, what next? Like, how are ways that we can incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems, or how can we interact with Indigenous people? How can we still see them? Because they're very present everywhere that we're at. And so one huge thing is land back. And I know this can be a touchy subject for some, but this video really describes how important land back can be. So there are a lot of ways that you can engage. Maybe your family has extra property. Maybe you inherited something. There are ways that you can help tribes reclaim their land. And so you can donate. And it is so crucial, because most of the earth on the planet, I think it's about 70% of the whole earth, is stewarded by Indigenous people. And so it is really crucial that we, for just our well-being and our environmental well-being, that we return these lands so Indigenous people can, continue their practices and supporting that. And I just think it's a really important thing. So if you'd like some information, the Indian Collective does a lot of really phenomenal work, and there's a cool video that you can watch. It's pretty short. You can read books by Native authors. And so there are so many books. There's fiction, nonfiction. There's, books about healing. There's books about poetry. There's just tons of amazing Native authors. Birchbox Books, they do book boxes, and they have lots of Native authors available on their website. There are others, but this is an Indigenous owned company. So if you want to support them, maybe give a gift over the holidays, this is a great opportunity. Chemtem, A Journey Through Healing, is a phenomenal book. And if you do buy one, I suggest this one. This was written by a good friend and faculty at my university, Dr. Keishan Lyric Cooper. And in the Indigenous way, she edited the book. So she does have a chapter herself, but she really wanted to make sure that we honor all of those who have a huge amount of knowledge in our communities. And some have degrees, some do not. Some are academic, some are not, but it is an amazing collection. And so I highly suggest this book. You can purchase it on Amazon. There is a link if you'd like more information. There is curriculum that goes along with it for the TK-12, but a phenomenal book. So if you get a chance, I highly suggest it. You can also shop Native-owned products. And so often people, are like, where would I find these? And there are markets and things that you can attend. But Beyond Buckskin has a collective online resource of amazing products that are all Indigenous owned. So a cool opportunity, again, for gift giving, or just if you want to get yourself something nice. Another big thing that always comes up is protecting our sovereignty. And so there are ways that we can all do that. And there's some very amazing resources here for the National American Indian Rights Fund. And I highly suggest just going there and kind of even learning a little bit about what sovereignty looks like. Cases go up on the federal Supreme Courts all the time, and support in any way that you can contribute, even if it's just sharing knowledge, is really helpful. So just a very easy way that you can kind of support sovereignty and federal Indian policies. You can also donate. So if you just don't have time or capacity, but still want to be involved, the American Indian College Fund and the Native Fora program support a lot of undergraduate students and some graduate students, but they really help bridge the gap of why students aren't able to continue in school. And so small contributions, large contributions are all greatly appreciated. And then the last link is just for my own personal students. So you can also donate to our program, and a little goes a long way. They're just like fun things that we can do for students. Even sometimes it's providing snacks and making sure that they have healthy meals so that they can focus on their education. But if you have time or money, or just, want to learn a little bit more, here's some fun resources. And with that being said, Setdia, which means thank you in the Hoopa language. And I think that's it for me. And so I'll turn it back over for, I suppose, questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Sasheen, for this this rich presentation. And so we're going to open it up for people who have questions. So, Dr. Brame.
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned so much, and I have so many things that I want to follow up on for myself. So fun and really so I just really great. So one thing I just kind of want to maybe open up an idea of brainstorming and separately on this topic, because you mentioned and so, I'm a geeky librarian. I'm all about really recently in one of my classes working on citation values, like when you are writing, when you're writing, researching and so forth, who are you citing in your document, right? And so you mentioned right up this alley, because we're really looking at DEI and who are we citing, in our scholarship. And you mentioned that you had no articles to read or documents to read that were authored by Indigenous scholars, which is really fascinating and so important. There was just really quickly, there was an issue that Dr. Gabby and I have been talking about this a little bit, and there was an issue of some publication that was put out, and the issue was all about Black Lives Matter, and not a single African-American was cited in that particular issue. So it's really interesting, and it's not easy to kind of really do the work to figure out who are the authors that you're citing in the articles, because we go in like to the databases. I'm a librarian, right? And I teach people how to go into the databases and find articles on a topic, but we don't really look closely at who authored those articles necessarily, right? Not specifically in terms of their background and their history and their ethnicity and all that kind of stuff, which is really, really important. And it matters so much more than we really have understood in the past, I think. And our research databases have been opaque to this. So I would love, I don't know, to brainstorm. I just want to mention it because I find it really, it's something that's troubling me, and I'm curious about, and what can we do to make the scholarship, the background of scholars more evident and accessible to researchers who are looking at the sources of information, the perspectives, and where the scholarship is coming from. So I love that you mentioned that, and I'm thinking about it so much, and I would love to maybe start a separate conversation about what we can do to make something like that happen.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brome. I 100% understand. Like, it is also a frustration, and I've found articles that I think are going to be phenomenal and done the same thing, and then I've gone through and I'm like, well, this is not really what I was hoping. I do know that a lot of tribal and native and indigenous like knowledge and information is protected. And so there's a lot of reason why, there isn't a lot of publications on a lot of things. And it was obviously for protection, but there are, things that I think are worth, noting, that there are articles, I've seen several that are written about, indigenous or Aboriginal folks that are really not at all from their worldview. And it's still that very anthropological viewpoint of kind of looking from the outside in. And so I have some ideas and some thoughts, but also I'm all really excited because I know that there is a lot of up and coming scholars that are really doing, a lot of this work and kind of reclaiming some of these things. And I think, for a lot of communities, this is really important. So I'm really excited, I think, for the future.
Go ahead, Dr. Gabby.
Oh, no, I was just going to jump in and Sasheen, so we're having, those of us in the center, I would be completely transparent. We're having these conversations in the background about, a bibliography project, because I think what happens is, because even I'm doing some self-reflection, right? Like what's in my, and for those of you in the room that have had me, you've seen my syllabi, it's not for lack of trying. What do I have in there? Have I accounted for everything? These are conversations that we're actively having. So you've given us a lot to think about. And I think it's like, that snowball effect. It started with George's presentation and now hearing you. And in the background, we're having this conversation about putting together a bibliography project so that if we have it readily available, we can encourage faculty, because part of it is finding research that fits, right? So I'm thinking in my classes, like around resilience. I know that I just did a quick search and I didn't even think of it. Resilience is a big topic. It might not be called resilience, but that idea, but even as it pertains to leadership, there's a lot of stories just because it's not called leadership. So in the background, we're having these conversations and you might see us smiling because we're starting to get excited about how can we contribute? What can we do at Pepperdine? And for those of you that have sat in on some of the other conversations we've had, you see that we are actively doing things at GSEP to create more belonging for our students, and to create more of this inclusive environment. So I just wanted to tell you thank you, because every single conversation just adds to that. And there's excitement. Like, so we're in the background sitting here. It's like, okay, what can we do? How can we, how can we do better, if you will? So thank you for that. If you have any recommendations, I've already put the books that you put in there on the list. But just wanted to share that even in this short period of time, there's already been an impact. So thank you for that.
Kelsey, did you have a question? I saw a hand go up and then I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anybody. Okay, and then Alexis. Go ahead.
So thank you so much for sharing all this. I was wondering if you could expand on two things. You talked about the difference between ownership and belonging, and I wondered if you had any good strategies for trying to get particularly students who might not feel like who might need to be invited into that space to take more ownership on their campus, if you had any strategies for that. And then I also would love it if you could expand on, you talked about discovering some things about participatory leadership by looking at Indigenous leaders. And I would love to hear a little bit more about that research if you're willing to expand.
Oh, absolutely. So I love those questions. Thank you so much. Those are excellent questions. I'm going to start with the second one because it'll kind of then help me do the first one. So when I was looking at leadership models, again, a lot is not written about, and for good reason, but there are things that are written about. So the US, essentially the democracy that is created, was established to model the 6 Iroquois nations. And it's because they had a phenomenal democracy, and many people don't know that. And so essentially that's what it was all based on. And the Iroquois nation were very large nations, and they each had representatives. And these representatives were the leaders of their respective communities. And what would happen is these leaders would convene and they would discuss the issues on a larger level. So, you know, maybe one tribe was dealing with this issue and another was dealing with another, but it was how can we make sure to help the collective? And so there are some key points about Indigenous leadership, which sometimes kind of get misconstrued. One of the things is there is a point person, there is a leader, there is an acknowledged person who is taking the lead. But leadership is not about power, it's about accountability and reciprocity. And so one of those things is that it is crucial for those who are taking leadership roles not to be so coerced by, you know, themselves and ego, but it's that you're accountable to those who you serve. And so it's really rooted in those who you serve. Also, the other kind of key component is that leaders aren't necessarily folks who step into those roles, but they're rather pushed into those roles. And that's because the community is really seeing that it is time for them to kind of step into that leadership role. They have been groomed, they have been trained and supported, and the community collectively will kind of push those leaders into those roles. And so it is a very crucial component that is a little different than how we do it now. During the conversation that the leaders would have, I mean, oftentimes they're not going to agree, right? Like that's just a reality of things. But one thing is that they could all support each other and really understand to make decisions what was best for the collective. So even if one, you know, individual group didn't get something that they need, it didn't mean that we shouldn't support the other 5. And that means that that one group, something will happen with them too, and we'll make it work out. But it was really about this collective working to make sure that all the people were taken care of. The leader also really supports those individuals because they are listening. They're constantly engaging. They're talking to the people that they're serving, so they know what's going on. They're not blindsided. That's where the participatory part comes in. And they're really asking for the community. So for example, where I work at ITEP, it was started because there were, the community saw a need for teachers, like Indigenous teachers, to teach in our schools because we have schools on reservations. And they didn't have any. And so they talked to the university and they said, hey, we got to do something about this. This is not going to work for us. And you're an institution, you should be helping us with teachers. And so they collectively came together and wrote a grant, and they established this program to support originally Native teachers that then expanded, you know, to further education and social services, and then expanded even further to incorporate now where we serve all students. But it was a community need. And so it's transitioned over time because the need for teachers, while we still need teachers, we need to support all Native students in the higher education sphere. And so it's evolved. And so that's part of it, is that it's constantly evolving. We never arrive, right? Like we're not done. We can't check off the list. We're constantly changing to make sure that we meet the needs of those we're serving. So in that same kind of space, when I'm thinking about ownership, a lot of the written work, and, you know, I do work in the DEI and, you know, B, I guess, essentially space, but I have a problem with belonging because that really goes with othering, and that's still making it that you're different. You aren't in the essential group. And for ownership, for me, that really switches it, right? It flips the switch on the narrative. It's not that like, oh, you're now belonging, you're now incorporated, you now feel like you're part of the whole, but rather you are always part of the whole. Like you are part of why this exists. And I think this is true just, you know, beyond Native communities. It goes for all communities that have been marginalized in some shape or form, but we have a rich knowledge system. And so for me, it's really honoring that. And so, you know, like just a way that I start off with my students is like, you know, whether they're just entering in an undergraduate program or transferring in, or they're in a master's or doctoral program, it's like, congratulations, you made it here, right? Like you come with so much knowledge and so much power, and like feel really good about that. And then again, just reiterating that purpose, like, why are you here? Because as we all know, navigating school for higher education is a challenge. Like we might not all agree with the things that are in the classes. I'm sure we've all had to deal with a faculty that made us uncomfortable. I mean, for me, I've never been represented in books or history or anything. And so for me, I always feel othered. I'm always in this sphere where I'm by myself. And so just kind of flipping that narrative and making sure students really understand that they are valued, I think is so crucial. And another really crucial piece is really developing that confidence level. And the confidence level is a challenge, you know. I think in any phase of life, we're all learners, right? We're lifelong learners. But for me, anytime that you're going through a space of growth, especially for Native students and, you know, other students as well, but in the Native spirits, it is especially true that there's a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome. I've experienced this many times, you know, even through this program very often, and that's a very real thing. And so for me, really supporting and promoting, you know, the accomplishments and really focusing on the growth space and the positivity and the why and the purpose has really helped to build confidence in our students on our campus. And then I think that the other piece is then that promotes self-efficacy, right? Because once they feel empowered and they have this self-esteem and they have this confidence and they have this ownership, they go and take it to the next level. And so now they're making changes and adjustments and they're contributing to the world because they know that they have that. For a lot of us, and I can only speak for myself really, and, you know, those that I work with, but when you don't feel validated or that your experiences are represented or that nobody knows who you are, right? Like it feels really bad. And so that small little bits of changes, it makes a huge impact. Like for even me personally, just like Pepperdine has been really good to me, and even just allowing me to talk to everybody tonight, I feel very appreciative of that because like it makes me feel seen. And so, you know, I am grateful for that. And I think those are just like my, you know, suggestions off the top of my head. There is a lot of literature, you know, talking about belonging, but very little about ownership. And so just thinking to the, like, we're constantly growing and learning and understanding things. And so for me, that's like the next iteration, I suppose. Did that answer your questions, Alexis?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I have a ton of notes now. I ran out of space.
Do we have other questions tonight? Margaret?
Thank you, Sash. Great job. It's just wonderful to be your friend and colleague, and it's just awesome to be in the cohort with you together. So thank you. This was amazing. And I have so many questions, but one thing I was thinking about as we were talking about the ownership piece is that a lot of what I understand from what you've told me is narrative storytelling over time that is not written down and is not collected in any way. And I was thinking, how do the younger kids, you know, they don't have storybooks. Like when I would, for instance, if I would read a story to my kids, they would have somebody that looked like them in their storybook. And I'm just wondering, beyond your family and storytelling, like how would they have that in school? And are there authors that you could recommend for younger children so that they could see that up close to start with? And even for my kids to see, you know, that there are different peoples in the world and we need to look at all of us. And the other piece I was thinking about was the narrative as you get into the higher levels of education. So we don't have a lot of the papers, and I loved the Indigenous leadership style that you shared with us in class. How do we take the narrative and not, how do we pull the storytelling out, I guess is what I'm asking, into real documents so that it can be shared without crossing the line, because storytelling is your community's process. And I don't want to, you know, say that we have to put it in writing, but how do we cross that?
Oh, thank you, friend. Those are excellent comments. I'm very excited. Thank you for coming. Yeah, I think those are excellent questions. And there are very limited amounts of children's books that are written by Native people. You know, when I was little, there were a few, but a lot of books were either authored or maybe, you know, illustrated by a non-Native person. And I remember just being little, and it was more so true even for generations before me, but just getting really excited because there isn't anything, right? And now we realize that maybe that wasn't the best because all the representation wasn't necessarily accurate or good. So on the box books, there are some Native children's authors. There are some resources too in the Chem book that I shared too for the TK-12 that has some of that information as well. And now like there's a lot more resources. And so I am really excited for school systems because there are like groups that are specifically looking at diverse of, authors and viewpoints and, just different things that represent more communities. And I think that's so important. So there are a lot of resources out there that are starting to prop up. As far as curriculum, it is a struggle. And, there's a big conversation about critical race theory, right? Whether it should be in schools, whether it shouldn't be in schools. But realistically, we need to start with the history, right? That we teach in schools. It is not accurate for anyone whatsoever. It is not representative of any group. It is very specific, and that narrative alone is very harming for many folks. And that's really where a lot of this stuff comes from when we're looking at implicit bias and, how microaggressions occurs. It comes from a lot of this stuff that's in the school systems. And so really, for me and my personal viewpoint is that it goes at a bigger level. Like we've got to change policies. We have got to do reform. The school systems were really built to do exactly what they're doing. So it's unfortunate, but that's why we have to shift the narrative. And so, any way that we can contribute to that. So I think by, giving your kids different books and, showing, like making sure, even if your kids are older and then grandchildren, just diversifying your thought process on a lot of things. It's just this constant, like every day that you're living it, right? Like it's not just during Native American Heritage Month or, Latinx Heritage Month or Black History Month. It's every day that we're doing this. And I think just infusing these things in there. And I think that that's what's so important. Luckily, where I live, there's a lot of work to kind of revamp some of the curriculum, and there is some really cool Indigenous curriculum resources. And so I can pop some of those in the chat, which are great for those who are in the TK-12 kind of sphere and beyond. But there is a big push for a lot of folks. And so I know some of my colleagues that work at the university where I are really trying to re-indigenize like the early childhood development kind of sphere as well, because we know that's so crucial for development. But I think it's just a lot of ways that we can constantly do it. And for me, just even if it's adding a book into your own, or an article, or it could be a video or anything, just like constantly changing that. For me, it's really reprogramming our brain, right, to re-indigenize, because ultimately we're all Indigenous from somewhere, wherever our families reside, we have this rich culture. And so really honoring that from, a global perspective, I think is really important. And so I think there's like a lot of ways that we can do it. And I wish I had like a more composite like list of something, but I can definitely get some resources in the chat.
So we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask, because I think it's really important when we're seeking to communicate about someone else's culture, that we realize that that's what we're doing, right? Like that we don't misrepresent, right? Because I think that is part of the challenge when we're talking about Indigenous wisdom, just all of the pieces of the puzzle that comes with cultural spaces. We often will put a Western framework around it and add value or take away value, as opposed to allowing it to speak for itself. And so how do you suggest that, as people who not only want to be allies and help, but also want to help with the scholarship and adding to the bibliography that is sorely lacking, Indigenous wisdom and writings, how do we do that in a way that honors the culture, the heritage, the history, without making it something that it's not?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think there's a lot of really good ways you can do it. And I think, again, it's a very, kind of like personal thing in which way that you want to contribute. A lot of it, we're all scholars, right? And so we know like the main way is like cite folks. And so, if we can honor those few, even though there's not tons of Native authors, there are some out there. And so for me, it's just really trying to support them. And like I said, sometimes it's just a few of them. But Dr. Minthorn and Dr. Schoten are two just absolute sheroes of mine that I really love. And they write a lot about higher education for Native students and really the Indigenous kind of leadership perspective. And so for me, it's just honoring those folks that are already doing the work, for one. And, you know, just like, even if it's just a shout out here and there on Twitter, it goes a long way, like surprisingly, but just this constant keeping us, I guess, relevant, because a lot of times we get erased, like, you know, even in statistics, you'll see it's always Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and then everything drops off. And they're like, well, you're too small of a population, so you don't really get a number or a count. And, you know, it's very frustrating. So to me, it's just like constant shifting the narrative. So any way that you can honor folks who are doing the work is really important. And I definitely have a lot of resources I would love to support and give out. So if anybody's interested, definitely email me and I'll give you those. I think the other piece is if you want to contribute to the scholarship, it's kind of an Indigenous model. Like, you go ask the community what they need, right? Like, we don't any other person's community and say, like, I'm doing this because that's what's right. And that's generally what's happened. And especially with Native peoples and anthropologists, it's been very much like, we're going to tell you what we need from you. We're going to tell you what you guys are doing. We're not going to ask you, like, we're just going to write about it. And so just engaging with communities, and, you know, there might be a need because we all have expertise in something. And so, you know, even if it's just contributing to an organization, maybe they need support on a grant or they need your expertise on something, but just working with those people, you know, and really understanding the needs. And this is harder, and this is just a general statement, but in our kind of system and paradigm where we're at now, is that like somebody is dominating, somebody takes the lead, and listening is not as important. And here's a good space to listen. And then, you know, the other piece is like, there's a lot of really cool people with really cool information and really cool ideas, but they don't have, you know, letters after their name. Right. And so sometimes, you know, it's engaging with folks that you might not necessarily see or think. And some of the best research that I've written, it's really just talking to like old, you know, aunties and uncles and grandmas and people in the community that are doing cool work, and, you know, obviously without exploitation of our culture, but like really that rich knowledge that is helpful for all of us. And just, again, honoring it. I know in the TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge realm, it's like a hot button word. So there's a lot of scientists out there using it, but really they're not honoring the knowledge systems in which it represents. And so again, just, I think honoring it, and we can do it in multiple ways, I think goes a really long way, especially as us as scholars, you know. And I think just even for myself, I'm always looking for new ways and ideas and thoughts and, you know, articles, books, all of that good stuff.
Okay, thank you. So it goes to building relationship and having community, right? Like that you don't just go in and say, I'm going to do this, but you go in and you develop relationships, and you listen and you share, and there's probably more we have in common than we have that what separates us. And then we kind of look at those connections. I want to get to Leanne's point in the chat, to the point of ownership. I wanted to share that the County of LA has recently instituted a policy to begin all official county proceedings with a land acknowledgement. I realize this is not equivalent to land back, but it does state that we occupy land that was seized from its original indigenous inhabitants. And I know that a number of universities, particularly the Ivy Leagues that are sitting on some of the larger land portions, have started doing that as well at the beginning of all of their events.
Yeah, it's a pretty great statement. It lists out the names of all of the tribes. I mean, it's not just like a little nod, you know, it's a robust statement. So I was proud of that.
Yeah,
that's awesome. And
that is awesome.
Putting a resource in the chat. So a faculty member at my university, and someone that I work with, and she's also from the same area that I'm from, Dr. Kutcher Brising-Baldy. She has a video about land acknowledgements if anybody is interested, and, you know, going beyond just that. But I am excited that there's a lot of folks that are now even doing that, and just, you know, knowing where you're at and where you stand, because I try to use it as a best practice, like anywhere I go, right? In the world, there's Indigenous people.
Right. So I think what we're going to do is save these resources in the chat and make them available on the center site, so that people can get to it if you weren't able to tonight. Does that sound reasonable, Sasheen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Brame, you have any? Okay. Well, it is we've come to the end of our time, and these have been really amazing and rich conversations that remind us that we are part of an amazing dynamic world, and that the wisdom from all culture is important for our survival, and not just survival, but us thriving. And so thank you for sharing your story and your wisdom with us. And we hope that in the days and weeks that are coming, we will sit with some of the information that we've learned tonight and see those common spaces, and think about our own stories and how we're passing that on to the next generation. So we thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope that you've enjoyed and received much information to inspire and inform your own scholarship where you find yourself, in ways in which to not just elevate our Indigenous culture, but to make sure that that we're elevating voices that are often just not seen and heard in the work that we do. We hope that you will join us for our next events coming up tomorrow and Friday, and we look forward to seeing you. Bid you all a good evening.